The service manager at Rideau Valley Motors slid the inspection report across the counter without looking up, and Harriet Bouchard stood there reading the number at the bottom of the page twice before she trusted herself to speak. $84,000. That was the estimate. For a 1987 Jaguar XJ6 that her father had driven exactly twice a week for 19 years. Once to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings, once to Mass on Sundays. The car sat in the lot outside with a crack in the driver's side mirror and a faded maple leaf air freshener dangling from the rear view. It was the most beloved and most ordinary object she had ever known. "The transmission is gone," the manager said. He had a lanyard with too many keycards on it, and spoke with the patience of someone who had explained the same thing many times and never enjoyed it. "Gearbox is compromised. Electrical harness has corrosion throughout. At this point, Mrs. Bouchard, the honest thing to tell you is that you'd be putting good money into a car that will never drive the way it used to." Harriet was 51 years old. She was not a woman who cried in public, not since her husband's funeral 7 years ago, when she had stood outside St. Patrick's in Ottawa in January cold and wept until her coat was damp at the shoulders. She did not cry now. She thanked the manager, folded the estimate into her purse, and walked back to the car that the shop had loaned her while they held the Jaguar. She called the other two dealers from the parking lot. The first one gave her a phone assessment and quoted $62,000 minimum with no guarantee of success. The second actually looked at the car. She had it towed there the following morning, and the technician spent 40 minutes on it before emerging with the same verdict, phrased differently. "Ma'am, I've been doing this for 22 years. I know when a car's done." He said it gently, and she believed he meant it kindly, and she still drove home, feeling like something had been taken from her that no one was bothering to name. Her father, Bernard Bouchard, had passed 11 months ago. He had left her the house in Canada, the card table he'd built himself in the garage, and the Jaguar. The Jaguar she could not bring herself to sell and could not afford to fix and could not stop thinking about every time she looked out the kitchen window and saw it sitting in the driveway going nowhere. It was her youngest nephew, Callum, who mentioned the name. "There's this guy," Callum said one Sunday at dinner, not looking up from his plate. He was 16 and spoke in the careful half-sentences of someone trying not to seem too interested in anything. "Out near Merrickville. Dad took his truck there once. He doesn't advertise or anything, just works out of his own garage. Does he have a name?" Callum thought about it. "Something Whitmore or Whitfield. I can remember it if I look it up." The name was Warren Whitfield. He was 43 years old, though he looked older in the way that men who work with their hands often do, not worn out, just weathered, as though the years had settled into him rather than passing over him. He ran a two-bay garage behind his house on a gravel road 11 kilometers outside Merrickville, Ontario, a stretch of land that in November looked like a painting someone had started and abandoned. There was a hand-lettered sign on the gate that said "W. Whit Teat Defald Mechanical," and beneath it, in smaller letters that might have been added later, "We listen first." He had a daughter named Penny. She was 9 years old. She did her homework at the corner workbench in the garage on weekday afternoons, perched on a stool with her notebook open beside a jar of pens, and she had the particular concentration of a child who has learned to be comfortable in spaces that were built for other purposes. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's way of going still when she was thinking hard about something. Warren's wife, Susan, had died 4 years ago. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed in March, gone by October. She had been a nurse, practical and funny, the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday and called bullshit with tremendous affection. He had not been the same person since. He knew this. He did not spend much time trying to become the same person again, because he understood, gradually, that this was not how it worked. What he had was the work. He had always been good with engines, not just competent, not just trained, but genuinely good in the way that some people are good with language or music, a kind of fluency that goes past learning into something closer to instinct. He had worked for 12 years at a large fleet service center in Ottawa before the manager there, a man named Stuart Carruthers, decided that Warren's habit of questioning diagnostic software outputs was a liability and not an asset. "The computer says the injectors need replacing," Stuart had told him once, in the flat tone of someone closing a door. That's the end of the conversation. "The computer's measuring symptoms," Warren had said. "I'm trying to find the cause." He was let go 6 weeks later for what the paperwork called incompatibility with team workflow standards. He had taken his tools, driven home, and stood in his own driveway for a long time looking at the second bay of his garage that he'd been using for storage. Then he called his brother-in-law to help him move the storage, and he opened the doors, and he started taking in work. When Harriet called, he listened to the whole story before he said anything. She told him about the estimate from Rideau Valley, about the second dealer, about the third. She told him about her father and the Saturday market and the maple leaf air freshener without intending to mention it. The way you sometimes say the truest thing before you realize you've said it. "Can you bring it in Tuesday?" Warren said. The other mechanic said it wasn't worth fixing. "That might be right," he said. "I won't know until I look at it. But I'd like to look." She had the car towed to Merrickville on a Tuesday morning in early December. The day was gray and still, the kind of cold that had no wind in it, just wait. She waited in her car at the end of the gravel drive, while Warren walked around the Jaguar once with his hands in his jacket pockets. He looked at it the way you might look at a room you used to live in. Then he thanked the tow truck driver, and the tow truck left, and Warren opened the garage and they pushed the Jaguar in together. Penny was at school. The garage smelled like machine oil and cedar, and, faintly, like the coffee that was still in a mug on the shelf by the door. "You don't need to stay," Warren said. "I'd like to," Harriet said. He nodded, and he started. He did not reach for the diagnostic scanner. He didn't connect anything to the OBD port or run any software. He opened the bonnet and stood with a shop light angled down into the engine bay, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he moved to the driver's seat and turned the key, just to the accessory position, not to start, and listened. Then he got back out and crouched beside the rear wheel well and listened some more. "You said it started hesitating about 8 months ago," he said from under the car, his voice coming out slightly muffled. "Before it stopped engaging first gear entirely." "In the spring," Harriet said. "April, I think. My father mentioned it. Did he ever say it felt like it was hunting, like the engine was looking for a gear and couldn't settle?" "Yes, he said it exactly like that. He said it felt like it was searching." Warren came out from under the car and stood up slowly, one hand on his knee. He looked at the engine bay for another moment. "The other shops connected diagnostics," he said. "They would have pulled transmission fault codes. That's standard practice, and the codes were real. The transmission was throwing faults, but the faults are downstream." Harriet waited. "There's a throttle position sensor on this car. It's a small component about the size of a matchbook. Its job is to tell the transmission controller how much load the engine is under at any given moment, so the gearbox knows when to change. If the sensor starts drifting, sending a load signal that's higher or lower than reality, the gearbox starts making the wrong decisions. It hunts. It hesitates. It eventually stops trusting itself and throws fault codes, and when you run diagnostics, what you see is transmission failure, because that's where the faults register." He picked up a rag from the bench and wiped his hands without looking at them. "But the transmission isn't the failure. The sensor is wrong, and the sensor costs about $70. Harriet stood very still. Outside, a crow landed on the fence post at the end of the drive and sat there for a moment, and then lifted again into the gray sky. "You're sure," she said. "I won't know until I have it out and test it. But, yes, I'm sure enough." He had the sensor out by early afternoon. He tested it with a multimeter on the bench, and the readings confirmed what he had heard in the car before he touched a single tool. The output was drifting, not catastrophically, not in a way that would show up as a sensor failure code, but enough to corrupt the signal continuously, consistently, invisibly, enough to convince every diagnostic system that consulted it that the gearbox was the problem. He called Harriet at 2:20. "It's the sensor," he said. "I have a replacement coming from an auto parts supplier in Brockville. It'll be here Thursday. I'll have the car done by Friday afternoon." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How much?" "Parts and labor. You're looking at around $240. Another silence. "One of the other shops quoted me $84,000. I know. Don't you want to know how I know you're right?" "You already know I'm right," Warren said. "That's why you went quiet." He was right about that too. Penny was at the workbench when Harriet came to collect the car on Friday. She had a science worksheet in front of her and she was drawing something in the margin. A horse, or possibly a dog, it was hard to say, and she looked up when the door opened with the direct, uncomplicated gaze of a child who is not afraid of strangers. "Is that your Jaguar?" Penny asked. "It was my father's," Harriet said. Penny considered this. "My dad fixed it." "He did. He fixes things other people say are broken." She said it without pride, just as a statement of fact, the way she might report that the sky was a particular color. Then she went back to her worksheet. Warren was finishing up the paperwork at the bench on the other side of the garage. Harriet watched him for a moment before she walked over. The way he moved, unhurried, putting things back where they belonged, the same economy of motion she'd noticed when he worked on the car. She thought about her father, who had been a carpenter, who had always said that you could tell everything about a craftsman by the way they treated their tools at the end of a job. "I want to ask you something," she said. He looked up. "Why did the other shops miss it? They're not stupid men." Warren set down the clipboard. He thought about it for a moment, and she had the impression this was something he had also thought about before, many times, in different forms. "The software isn't wrong," he said. "The diagnostic system saw real faults. The problem is that when a system tells you where the problem is, it becomes very hard to imagine that the problem might be somewhere else. You stop listening to the car and you start listening to the report." He paused. The car was telling the truth the whole time. It was hunting. It was searching. It just needed someone to hear that and ask why instead of asking what. Harriet paid him in cash. She had stopped at the ATM on the way, and she gave him a check as well for $100 extra. And when he tried to give it back, she told him not to be stubborn about it. She drove the Jaguar home. It ran quietly and smoothly, the way it had run when her father was alive, and she sat in the driveway after she turned off the engine for a few minutes without going inside, her hands in her lap, the maple leaf air freshener turning slowly in the cold air from the heater vents. She called Callum that evening. "The Whitfield man," she said. "He fixed it." Callum said, in a voice that tried to be casual and wasn't quite. "For how much?" $240. A pause. "The other places said what, like 84,000. Callum made a sound that wasn't really a word. Harriet smiled. She didn't mean for it to go further than that. She told her sister because her sister asked, and her sister told her husband, who ran a small contracting company and had 3 work trucks he'd been having trouble with. Her brother-in-law drove out to Merrickville the following week and came home impressed in the way that skeptical men come home, impressed, quietly, without wanting to make too much of it. He sent 2 of his drivers out the week after that. By February, Warren had a 3-week wait list. He didn't advertise. He didn't have a website. He had a sign on the gate and a reputation that was spreading through a particular kind of word of mouth. The kind that travels between people who fix things for a living and have learned to recognize when someone else actually knows what they're doing. What happened in March was not something he had expected. A woman named Claudette Arsenault, who was the regional operations director for a mid-sized logistics company based in Nepean, had been referred to Warren by one of her fleet managers, who had been referred by a fuel distributor who had heard about the Jaguar from Harriet's brother-in-law's office manager. The chain of connection was long and improbable, and entirely typical of how things actually moved in that part of eastern Ontario. Claudette Arsenault's company ran 47 vehicles. 3 of them had been cycling through shop after shop, with intermittent issues that no one could definitively resolve. 2 transit vans and a medium-duty truck that was critical to her Brockville route. The combined cost in downtime, rentals, and inconclusive repair attempts over the past 8 months had been significant enough that it appeared as a line item in her quarterly report to the board. She drove out to Merrickville herself on a Tuesday morning, unannounced, the way people do, when they want to see the real version of a place rather than the prepared version. She was 55, composed, and did not waste time. Warren was under one of her fleet manager's vans when she arrived. She stood in the driveway and waited. After a few minutes he came out, registered her presence without appearing startled, wiped his hands, and asked how he could help. She told him about the 3 vehicles. He asked her questions. Not about the diagnostic reports she'd brought, which he set aside, but about how the vehicles behaved. When the problem appeared, whether it was temperature sensitive, what the drivers had noticed that the reports hadn't captured. Penny came home from school while they were talking. She set her bag down by the gate, pulled a granola bar from the front pocket, and walked into the garage without looking at the visitor. She climbed onto her stool at the workbench and opened her notebook. Claudette watched her for a moment. "Your daughter," she said. "Yes?" Warren said, "She seems comfortable here. She's been coming since she was 5, he said. "She knows not to touch anything with an orange tag." Claudette looked at the workbench, where a row of parts sat with small orange stickers on them. Then she looked at the sign on the gate that she could read from where she stood. "We listen first." "What does that mean to you?" she said. "That sign." Warren thought about it for a moment in the way he had when Harriet had asked him why the other shops missed it. The same pause, the same impression of a man who has a real answer and is deciding how to say it accurately rather than impressively. "Most diagnostic processes start with the report," he said. "You connect the system, you read the codes, and the codes tell you where to go. And that works. Most of the time. But codes are a record of what the system noticed, not necessarily of what happened. The car, the machine, is always doing something before it starts failing. There's a period where it's trying to compensate, trying to work around a problem it can sense and can't fix. If you listen during that period, you hear things the codes will never show you." He looked at the van in the bay. "Listening first just means you don't let the report close the question before you've heard the whole thing." Claudette Arsenault stood quietly for a moment. Outside, the March wind moved through the spruce trees at the back of the property with a low, uneven sound. "I'd like you to look at all 3 vehicles," she said. He found the problem in the first van in under 2 hours. A degraded ground strap, creating an intermittent voltage drop that was corrupting sensor data and producing fault codes across multiple unrelated systems. The kind of issue that sent shops chasing codes in circles indefinitely, because every time they addressed one set of codes, the voltage drop would express itself somewhere else. The second van had a cracked intake boot that was introducing unmetered air into the system on cold starts and disappearing as the rubber expanded with heat. Invisible on a warm engine diagnostic, obvious to anyone who knew to look for it on a cold Tuesday morning in March. The truck took longer. He worked on it for most of a Friday and part of a Saturday, and he didn't say much while he worked. And Penny brought him coffee at 3 o'clock without being asked, and set it on the stool beside the creeper and went back to her book. He found it finally in the late afternoon. A factory wiring harness that had a section routed too close to an exhaust component, causing periodic heat damage that was just severe enough to affect signal integrity under sustained load. The fix required rerouting and re-insulating about 18 inches of wiring. It took him 40 minutes once he knew what he was doing. He called Claudette on the Saturday evening. She answered on the second ring. "All 3, he said. "All 3 what?" "I found all 3 problems." A pause. "What was it?" he explained. She listened without interrupting, which he noticed, because most people who were not mechanics interrupted with questions that revealed they had stopped following and were trying to seem like they hadn't. "How long have your shops been trying to resolve these?" he said. "The vans since last June," she said. "The truck since September. And the total cost so far?" She named a number. He didn't respond to the number because there was nothing useful to say about it. "I want to talk to you about an arrangement," Claudette said. "I don't mean hiring you. I know you're not set up for that and I'm not suggesting it. I mean a consulting arrangement. My fleet managers bring you difficult cases. You tell them what you think. We pay you for your time whether or not you find something." Warren was in the kitchen by this point. Penny was at the table with a bowl of cereal and a library book, even though it was 7:30 at night, because she had inherited her mother's relationship with schedules, which was that they were suggestions. "I'd need to think about that," he said. "I know," Claudette said. "Take the time you need." He looked at Penny, who was reading with her spoon halfway between the bowl and her mouth, absorbed in something on the page. He thought about Stuart Carruthers, who had told him that the computer said the injectors needed replacing, and that was the end of the conversation. He thought about the 3 fleet managers who had spent 8 months and considerable money going nowhere because they had let the reports close the question too early. "I'll think about it this week," he said, "and I'll call you Thursday." He did call on Thursday, and he said yes, and the arrangement that followed was not complicated or glamorous, but it was, in its way, exactly right. The kind of work that rewarded the particular thing he was actually good at, which was not speed or volume or the efficient processing of standard cases, but the slow, patient attention that a difficult problem actually required. He did not take on more work than he could do well. He kept the 2-bay garage behind the house in Merrickville. He kept the hand-lettered sign on the gate. He kept Penny's stool at the corner workbench. What changed was smaller and larger at the same time. Fleet managers from 3 other companies called over the following year, referred by Claudette's office. A journalist from an Ottawa trade publication came out in October and wrote a short piece that Warren gave 1 interview for and never read. A former colleague from the Fleet Center in Ottawa, not Stuart Carruthers, someone who had worked alongside Warren and left before he did, called to say he'd seen the article and was glad. Harriet came back in May, not because the car had any problem, but because she had found, in her father's papers, a photograph of the Jaguar from 1991, and she thought Warren might like to see it. He did. He held it for a long time under the shop light before he handed it back, and he said it looked like a car that had been well loved, and Harriet said that was exactly right. Penny was doing a geography project at the workbench that afternoon, coloring in a map of the Canadian provinces with the set of markers that had a tendency to bleed at the edges. She was using a paper towel underneath each province to keep the colors contained. She had the focused, methodical approach of someone who had spent years watching a person solve problems, not skipping steps. Before Harriet left, Penny looked up from the map. "Did your dad teach you things?" she said. Not the question Harriet had expected. "He tried," Harriet said. "I wasn't always paying attention." Penny seemed to consider this with some seriousness. "My dad says you learn more from the things you actually do than from the things people tell you about doing them. He's probably right." Penny nodded once, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected, and went back to her map. Warren was at the gate when Harriet walked out to the Jaguar, wiping his hands on a rag the way he always seemed to be wiping his hands, unhurried, everything put back in its place. The afternoon light was long and flat across the gravel, and the spruce trees at the back of the property stood the way they always stood, indifferent and permanent. "Same time next year," he said, which was his version of a joke. "Don't be surprised," Harriet said. She drove the Jaguar home along the county road, the engine running clean, and even beneath her, the maple leaf air freshener turning in the warm air from the vents. And she thought about her father, who had believed that the most important thing you could do for anything, a garden, a piece of wood, a person, was to pay attention to it before you decided you knew what it needed. She thought he would have liked Warren Whitfield. She thought he would have liked, especially, the sign on the gate.